Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Mr. Schnapf, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Sure. I'm Larry Schnapf. I'm a environmental lawyer in New York. I've been practicing law for about 40 something years. Um, and I've also been, working, researching in the JFK arena. And I've been trying to use my legal skills to advance the answering the questions in the assassination and trying to get the records released. In 2017, I helped organize a mock trial in working through CAPA at the South Texas College of Law. It was called the State of Texas versus Lee Harvey Oswald. And interestingly, there have been 7 mock trials that have been held by law schools and bar associations since 1967. And 6 of the 7 have resulted in either an acquittal or a hung jury. The only one that resulted in a conviction of Lee Oswald was the 1986 televised mock trial with Vincent Bugliosi as the prosecutor and Jerry Spence as the defense attorney. And there are reasons why that outcome occurred. One of which is Bugliosi was a very good lawyer, but more importantly, Jerry Spence was doing more of his theatrics rather than dealing with the evidence. But the idea that you have 6 out of 7 mock trials showing that indicating that there's reasonable doubt in the government's official, conclusion it's not just like 1 or 2, it's 6. And the one in 1992 was the ABA, the American Bar Association, with attorneys like David Boyles. I mean, one of the best attorneys in the country. So we did a mock trial in 2017. Ours was a little different because this is the first time we actually used experts in the questions, the forensic questions and the medical evidence. And we got a hung jury. We spent day one. Bob Tannenbaum was the attorney for day one, and he took the evidence through on the medical evidence to show there was a shot from the front. And then day 2 was the actual defense of Oswald, which Bill Simpich and I did. So I did that. And then after President Trump postponed the records, I got engaged much more into the actual JFK Records Act. And when President Biden took over, I organized a group of open government or good government organizations, prominent researchers and historians, lawyers, and cobbled together some letters we sent to the House Oversight Committee and the Senate Oversight Committee asking for the Congress to hold a hearing on the failure of the executive branch to not comply with the JFK Records Act. My Congressperson, Carolyn Maloney, at the time, had been chair of the Oversight Committee. And so I directly appealed to her as a constituent. And they didn't, while there was some back channel stuff, they didn't actually hold the hearing that we wanted because it would embarrass the president. And after that was unsuccessful, I filed a lawsuit against the National Archives to get the records and the correspondence relating to the decisions by President Trump to postpone the records in 2017 and 2018. And we can talk about that in a minute. And that was very revealing. And then after President Biden postponed the records in 22, I worked with Bill Simpich and Mary Farrell and Josiah Thompson and Gary Aguilar to bring a lawsuit against the President Biden, and the National Archives for failure to comply with the act, and asking for injunctive relief, asking the court to actually order the president and the National Archives to release the records in accordance with the law, but also to continue to search for the records that are not in the collection. So let's take a step back for your reader. So that's the introduction of me. Now let's talk a step about why are we here. So in 1992, the JFK Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by President Bush. And that was in response to the Oliver Stone movie, where at the end of the movie, he revealed that there were millions of records that were not released about the JFK assassination. So Congress basically set up this. The law provided that all the agencies, government offices, had to scour their records for assassination records and transmit them to the National Archives. And the National Archives was to create a JFK records collection, which would hold all of the records pertaining to the assassination of President Kennedy. Up until this point, these records were physically in the possession of the various agencies. They were not at the National Archives. Now, some of them might be at the National Archives in a segregated collection that was controlled by, say, the CIA or something. But for the most part, they were in other agency records, locations. In addition, the act created an Assassination Records Review Board to review records to determine if they could be declassified. And the review board had the authority to overrule requests for postponement by the agencies that had equities or ownership or interest in the records. And there were certain criteria that had to be met. Essentially, the overarching requirement was that there was a presumption that the records would be released, and that they would be released unless the agency could show that there was an identifiable harm that was of such gravity to national security that it would outweigh the strong public interest in disclosure. And so the agencies had to make that showing to, we call a Section 6 showing, Section 6 of the statute, to the review board. It had to be a clear and compelling evidence, which is very high level. That's almost like criminal level. Like, in a crime, when you're doing a criminal action, you have to show beyond a reasonable doubt, whereas in a civil action, it's just a preponderance of the evidence, the majority of the evidence. So it's a very high standard the agencies had to meet. And the review board did agree to postpone. And so if the review board decided to release a record that the agency wanted to be postponed, the agency could appeal to the president. And in the beginning, the FBI was probably the leading agency that was trying to appeal decisions to the President Clinton. And basically, the White House said, "Guys, work it out." So the review board operated from 94 to 98, and really 95 to 98, but essentially 94 to 98. And the Congress declined to fund it after 98. So the review board went out of business on September 30th, 1998. So they went out of business because they did not have any more funds. They did not go out of business because they had finished their work. So when the review board went out of business in 1998, there were outstanding requests for records that had been sent out to a number of agencies, including the CIA. And in order to follow up on these requests to get the records, the ARB and the National Archives and the CIA entered into a memorandum of understanding, whereby the National Archives would basically supervise and ensure that the archive, the CIA complied with its obligations under the agreement. And unfortunately, the National Archives did not follow up on that. In addition, there were some other records that were being looked for. For example, there were records that Bobby Kennedy had taken from the White House right after the assassination. He took them out of the Oval Office safe and became part of the Robert Kennedy personal papers. And the ARB was trying to get the RFK Family Trust to release those records at the time they went out of business. And there were going to be ongoing negotiations, and the National Archives never followed up on that. So there are records there are records that are in the possession of the federal government that are considered assassination records and that are not in the physical collection. So when the ARB agreed to postpone the records, for the most part, the statute said that if records are postponed, all records should be released 25 years after the date of the act, which was October 26th, 2017. And what happened was basically, now there was a provision for periodic review. So the idea that Congress had was when records were postponed, there would be some periodic review of these records while, during the period of time between 98 and 2017, there was very little work done like that. So now we suddenly have the deadline of 2017 coming. And from my lawsuit, what I could see was that in the spring of 2017, the National Archives came up with a guidance document, which was signed up. The National Security Council was tasked with being in charge of the process of reviewing and releasing the records. And they got an opinion of counsel from the Department of Justice as to what the requirements were. And it really, it made some distinctions that really seemed to fly in the face of the language of the statute, because the statute is what we call a remedial statute, which means it's to be liberally and broadly interpreted, because it was designed to address a problem. And the problem was, and it says right in the statute, in the introduction of the statute, that the way that the Freedom of Information Act and the national security executive orders had been implemented by the executive branch was preventing the full disclosure of these JFK records, and Congress wanted the records released promptly. So, but unfortunately, the Department of Justice came up with an opinion that the clear and compelling case by case or record by record requirement, that only applied to the process that occurred before 2017, but it did not apply to the current process. And that gave the president a lot more wiggle room with not having to make the standard for postponing the records was lowered. And also they didn't have to do this record by record review. So based on that interpretation, NARA comes up with this guidance document, which is used for the agencies to determine. Basically what NARA said was, we have these records, they're going to be released on October 26, 2017, unless you tell us you want them postponed. And then over the summer of 2017, the agencies made requests for postponement. And initially, the National Archives objected to those, particularly to the request by the FBI and the CIA. And I actually have memos from the archivist to the agency saying, your requests for postponement do not comply with the act. And they don't comply with the interpretations of the act by the ARB. So the National Archives actually tried. Now, it does not appear that they were looking at the slips that Andrew Ehler had mentioned in a prior podcast. Basically, what they did was the National Archives took a spreadsheet of all of the documents, gave them to the agencies for them to review and determine if they were going to be released based on the criteria in the guidance document that the ARB prepared, that the NARA prepared. Now, there was some criteria in the guidance document that departed from the law. So one was, for example, impact on current operations. Now, there's nothing, that phraseology does not appear in the statute, but that was in the guidance document. And that's because the guidance document was essentially reviewed and approved by the National Security Council. The National Security Council was the one that was shepherding this process. They hijacked the process. So the only entity that was representing the public interest in this initial period was the National Archives. They were doing their best, but they don't have declassification authority like the ARB did. So when they would make a recommendation initially that this does not comply with the act, they were overruled to the point where in September of 2017, they were actually asked, the archivist was asked to make a recommendation to postpone the records. So being the good bureaucrat that they are, they agreed to that request because they're trying to cooperate. And, the National Archives has had a very difficult relationship with the CIA over the years. And in the litigation that I and Bill Simpich brought, it became apparent in our conversations with the parties that the National Archives was really interested in maintaining a good relationship with the CIA so they can get records, released to the archives. Um, so when President Trump went on Twitter on 2 days before the deadline to release the records, in October 24th, 2017, he says the records are going to be released. Well, when he was saying that, there was actually version 12 of an executive order being drafted that would postpone the records. So the records were postponed at the request of the National Security Council, although, officially the archivist is the one that recommended it. But they were asked to write a memo to support this decision that was already made. So it was for 6.
Quick question. He made a statement that I spoke with Judge Tunheim about and Tom Samolick of the Assassination Records Review Board, where he stated that if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't release them either. Now, we all kind of agree that that was just like for a political purpose. It seems like the release of these files has been some type of political gain. But is that is that what you mean? Like very similar to the aspect of him going out on Twitter saying these are going to be released, but they're going to be postponed, was just him kind of putting out a ploy, just trying to get people riled up. I mean, that's kind of what Trump does.
I would say that what we've learned, what my litigation revealed, and what Donald Trump eventually, a few weeks ago, actually to Sean Hannity revealed, was that the CIA intervened. Mike Pompeo, at the last minute, told the president, you can't release these records. So this is while there's an executive order circulating. It's a draft being circulated saying we're going to postpone the records. But President Trump hadn't seen these yet. In fact, there's no evidence that he ever saw any documents. So when he went and told Judge Napolitano, when Judge Napolitano asked him, Mr. President, why did you postpone the records? And he said, if you saw what I saw, you'd know why. To me, that was typical bravado by President Trump. He did not want to admit that he'd been played by Mike Pompeo. Now, he trusted Mike Pompeo. Mike Pompeo said, Mr. President, there are names involved in these records, and if we release the names, bad things could happen, and it could make it very difficult for us to get new people to work for us undercover because we made promises to these people that we would never reveal their names, and if we reveal their names, even if it's 60 years ago, somehow this is going to affect our ability to get new people to work for us. So Trump trusted Pompeo's representation to him, and then he agreed to postpone the records. But when he said, if you saw what I saw, there's no evidence that they may have gave him some spreadsheets, but there's no evidence that he ever saw those records. And his most recent statements are that Pompeo told him, and he said, look, these people are good Americans and they have the best interests in the country, and so I trusted them. So that's what he's saying now is more reflective of what the documents produced in my litigation. They produced over 1,000 pages of documents to me. So that statement was incorrect. So then in 2018, the 6-month period is up, and the same thing happens. The archives doesn't agree with the postponements, but they're forced to write a memo to the president requesting a postponement. And I haven't, and there was a disagreement about how long. And I have an email from the chief executive officer of the National Archives, Bosanko, to the archivist, David Ferrara, saying the president's going to have to live with this date. So they disagreed with the period of time that was being proposed, so they're writing a memo asking for the president to postpone the record, and the period of time that they're asking is being told to them by the National Security Council, saying this is how long it's going to have to be. So, but there's no evidence that they ever looked at any of these slips. All they did was they basically set up a process where they gave the agencies, these are the records we have of yours in the collection that we're going to release unless you tell us otherwise. And then the agencies had to present the grounds for postponement. And there's no evidence that the grounds for postponement were different than those that the ARB had already indicated. So, the stuff that I I'm referring you to was produced in litigation. These are not records that would be in the archives. They were correspondence and emails. They might be, for example, if somebody wanted to see them, they probably have to go to the Trump library when it opens and see that correspondence. But this is not the stuff that's typically stored at the National Archives. So we don't know. I don't have yet the records from the Biden administration, but I have no reason to believe that they use a different process. The National Security Council was still the agency that was coordinating and directing everything. And, you know, the Biden has several rounds of postponements. Records are released, but then at the end of the day, his final executive order in June of 23, where he announces this is the final act under the statute, which is not what the statute says. The statute says that only the archivist can certify that all the records have been released in accordance with the statute. Archivists have never made that certification. So that in itself was, in my opinion, was ultra vires by the president. But then they created these transparency plans, which would govern, which would identify what they wanted to do was get away from these every 6 months or a year reviewing records. So they came up with these transparency plans that were given to the National Declassification Center, and the transparency plans identified circumstances or events that when they occurred, then the Declassification Center, which is a part of NARA, would then consult with the agency that has the equities in the records to determine if the record could be released. The earliest of these events that are in these transparency plans, and they're for each agency, CIA, FBI, Department of Defense, State Department, the earliest of these events would have occurred in the 2040s. Now, Congress passed the JFK Records Act in 1992 because at that point in time, the earliest that the records would have been released would have been 2029. And they were concerned about another 50 years of postponements, right? Or 50, 20, 40 years. So the transparency plans actually provide for dates of release, possible release, which is far beyond the time that Congress was concerned about in the first place. So now, so then we sued Mary Farrell and Josiah Thompson and Gary Agley. We sued the president and the National Archives for failing to comply with the act. The court throws out the president. It's very unusual for president for a court to order a president to do something. It's usually through the agencies, but we tried. We just thought that this was a special act. And then also we asked for injunctive relief requiring National Archives to continue to search for the records. Now, interestingly, in 2000, so the ARB had published regulations and the regulations essentially were definitions of what assassination records are and some other things. And when the ARB went out of business, NARA moved the regulations from the portion of the federal code where the ARB had put their regulations, and it brought these regulations into its set part of the federal code. And in doing so, it announced that it was the successor in function to the ARB. So we said, hey, the National Archives is saying it is a successor in function to the ARB. And what was one of the functions of the ARB was to go search for additional records. And they haven't done that. And so that was one of the bases for us suing them. In addition, when people would go to the National Archives and say, I want this record, we want this record, and they say it's not in the collection, instead of searching and contacting the agency, the archives would tell the researcher, well, go use a FOIA request against the agency whose record it is. When Congress said in the JFK Act that the reason we're passing this law is because FOIA doesn't work. So what should have been going on at that point was that NARA should have been contacting the agency itself and saying, please turn this record over. In fact, there are emails from NARA to researchers saying, if you become aware of a record that's not in the collection, please let us know. And they haven't done anything. So Um,
Now, is that just because it's like government neglect or just slow working government? But also, what about the Kennedy family? They've kept a lot of things private from researchers, and only certain researchers had the grace of the Kennedy family to review things, like Cyril Wecht did. But a lot of this stuff and information that's been blocked for so long, I don't think it's like some type of grand cover up. Honestly, I don't think there's anything really important in the files. I just think at this point now, the purpose of it is that they should be released. We shouldn't have any more secret. Plenty of people that have passed away that have waited years for these files to be released. But I think when you're really examining it, it just seems like slow government. It seems like everybody just pushing it off because they can and nobody's going to stop them, which I think someone needs to. And I understand there's things set in place maybe to try and do that, but it just feels like it never gets followed up. And I think it's because we're dealing with letter agencies and certain individuals or certain things that we don't really know a whole lot about compared to what they are on the surface, if that makes sense. Not to sound super conspiracy, but just kind of examining it from a point of things not functioning right in a normal basis.
yeah, no, I think that's a fair statement. I deal with it. I deal with state agencies and federal agencies all the time in my practice. I have to deal. I mean, my practice is administrative law, environment as an environmental lawyer. I mean, I use FOIA and I have to search for records and deal with agencies. So yes, there's a lot of this is, um, there. NARA didn't have anyone assigned to this JFK collection for many, many years. And then it was only like in anticipation of the 2017 um, deadline, they started hiring staff and assigning staff to get ready, for this process. But like everything else, there are budgetary issues and staffing issues, resource issues. And, honestly, there is always getting is overwhelmed with requests for FOIA, FOIA requests, and they have limited staffing, and these records should have been all scanned, right? And they haven't been scanned yet. It's another problem of the government, federal government. It's just a lot of this is clumsy, bureaucratic stuff, and again, as you mentioned, these are all bureaucrats. So there is actually an email that I got where the head of the NARA is explaining to a person, I think it was at the CIA, or it could have been Defense Department, where he's saying, we're not trying to be difficult. We're just giving you the benefit. We're just trying to give you the benefit of our experience with these records. So, they deal with these officers that are in the information area all the time, and they create these relationships. And so it isn't like they're strangers. And so you don't want to piss people off because then you're not going to get cooperation from them. And it was very clear to me in my interactions with the archives that they had a bad relationship with the CIA for a long time. It's gotten better. And they really don't want to do anything to ruin that relationship. And so they don't press the CIA too hard. So so fast forward to now, President Trump, uh, comes into office, and on day 3, he issues an executive order. He's promised on his campaign. He said a couple different things on the campaign trail. One was he was going to appoint a commission to investigate attempted assassinations. Okay. Then he said he was going to release the records. So, he said different things on a campaign, but the theme was he was going to take some action to release the records. And in fact, his executive order states that he says it's now in the public interest to release the records. Enough time has passed. But instead of saying, and then I hereby order the National Archives to release all the records, he says, instead, I hereby instruct the Director of National Intelligence, that's Tulsi Gabbard, the Attorney General, that's Pam Bondi, the National Security Advisor, I forgot who he is now, to come up with a plan to declassify the records and then submit it to the President and the White House Counsel, which is David Warrington. That was to be done in 15 days. 15 days was February 7th. On February 7th, there was a report in WABC radio, I think it was, saying that a plan was submitted. Now, here's the problem. It was only 2.5 years ago that the agencies came up with transparency plans that called for records to be released reviewed in the 2040s. And now suddenly 2.5 years later, are they going to now say, okay, we didn't really mean it. All the records can be released now? That's not going to happen. We know for sure that there's going to be additional requests for redactions. The question is, so let's take a step back. President Trump fired 150 people that worked at the NSC. Presumably the people that he's replacing them with are going to want to follow his instructions or his desire to release the records. And I presume that Pam Bondi and Gabby Tulsi Gabbard, I presume that they want to please him as well. So it'll be interesting to see whether they actually, override the request by their middle management to postpone records further. Pam Bondi said Friday night that she had records on her desk, JFK records on her desk. Whether they're transparency plans or whether they're the actual records, it's unclear. We're hoping that because of the people that are now in decision-making positions, that they're all loyalists to President Trump, that they're going to take actions that will be consistent with what he said in his executive order, which was the time has come. I still think there's going to be some redactions because it's hard to believe that they're going to agree just to say, I didn't mean it last time. And then but what's happened, I sent the letter to David Warrington. I have a mutual friend that knows him. And so the president's order said, release the records in the possession of the federal government. And what I wanted to make sure, to make it very clear, was that the records in the possession of the federal government are not limited to those in the JFK collection. Because the reviews in 2017, in 2018, in 22 and 23 only involved review of the records in the collection. There's been a complete, no one has ever followed up on the searches the ARB requested in 98. So I sent a letter to David Warrington advising him that in order to fully comply with the president's order, he's got to make sure that these plans call for completing the searches of the outstanding searches of the ARB. And I listed the records that they were looking for. And you can see them in the final report, the ARB final report. It tells you where the status of those records were. For example, now the one thing that the ARB report did not have in it, the final ARB report in 98, when they talked about Carlos Marcello, they only talked about the Bride Lab sting operation from 1980, 81, somewhere around there. They did not talk about the second sting operation, which was the Camtech sting operation, where he was in jail in Texarkana, Texas, and he allegedly confessed to his cellmate, who was an undercover agent, Jack Van Langingham, that he was behind the assassination. Those records, those tapes were sealed in connection with the sting operation. And since they weren't used in the actual criminal action, they were sealed. The ARB never saw those tapes. They got transcripts of the tapes from the Bride Lab, but they never heard or saw anything about the Camtech's sting operation from the mid-'80s. It's important to hear Marcello's voice. Anyone that is a reporter or a lawyer knows that listening to the person as they're speaking is as important as what their words are on print, because you hear the way people say things gives you lots of information. Like, was he suffering from dementia, or was he really lucid when he was saying this, for example? So that's one of the things that I mentioned in my letter. I also mentioned about the Joannides files and a few other things. So in addition to the president issuing this order, the House Oversight Committee formed a task force. And the task force was the task force on declassification or declassifying federal secrets. And Anna Luna from Florida has been appointed to be the chairwoman of this committee, this task force. And right now, it just consists of Republicans. I don't think any Democrats are going to volunteer for this, given the way things are in Congress right now. This task force is the oversight committee in both the House and the Senate have continuing jurisdiction over the JFK Act. And we tried to get them, as I said before, to conduct oversight during the Biden administration, and they declined. But apparently they're doing it now. And what they've done is they're looking at a number of things. One of them is JFK Act, JFK records, the Martin Luther King records, the Robert Kennedy records, and the Epstein records and UPAs, unidentified
Aerial phenomena.
Yeah.
UAPs. Yeah.
So Luna sent a letter last week to the heads that were identified in the president's executive order. So that's Gabbard, Bondi, and the National Security Advisor, asking for a status meeting on the 26th, so Wednesday, on where they are with the plan. And she says she wants to hold a hearing. Now, Luna said a couple interesting things when they announced this formation. She said she believed there were two shooters, but she also said she wanted to interview Warren commissioners.
Well, she wanted to interview the original doctors at Parkland or something like that. And I was like, there's only one of those guys left. So I don't know if she's talking about.
There's two, but there's only Jones is still alive, but he doesn't want to talk anymore. Dr. Curtis is still alive. And I actually, interviewed him a couple years ago, and I haven't had a chance yet to write up what he said to me. But he had some interesting things to say. But she said she did talk about the Warren commissioners. Now, maybe she was thinking about the staff. I don't know. She just was speaking very loosely. But the idea that they can have one hearing in March, and that's enough. But I like that she sent the letter because it's putting additional layer of pressure. We haven't had any interaction from Congress since 98. I mean, 97, they had a hearing where Judge Tunheim, they were supposed to have, their funding was through 97. And then Judge Tunheim went to a hearing for them to determine whether they should give him another year. And they asked him, well, if we give you another year, will you be able to complete your work? And he had to say yes, because if he said, no, I need more time, they wouldn't have given him the money. So I had to say yes. And then, of course, halfway through the final year, they start losing staff. They start making they had to then begin changing the way they reviewed records. They just had to do things more on a they don't look at every record. They kind of look at them.
Broad brush it.
Yeah, well, some sort of random look. And then they also had certifications they were accepting. So the process was not as thorough in the final year because they had a rush to get things out. So I did mention in my letter to Warrington that we need to get the records from RFK. Now, to go to your question about the Kennedy family, I have a couple of ideas about what's going on. So Bobby Kennedy took those records out, an hour after the assassination from the Oval Office. I believe that the reason he did that was, first, there was lots of stuff in there probably about Cuba and the attempts to kill Castro, which no one knew about. And there was probably some stuff in there about the women with John Kennedy. So those I think he wanted to take those away. And I think Bobby was no longer in control, obviously, once the president was killed. And I think, he's reported to have said twice in 68 that if he was elected president, he would reopen his brother's investigation. The investigation of his brother's death. I think that he didn't want, and he did send Walter Sheridan down to New Orleans to monitor the Garrison investigation. And I think that Bobby didn't support it because, he wanted to control everything. Because that's, I think he was very, if it came out in the mid 60s that the Kennedy administration was behind the attempt to assassinate Castro, that could have destroyed Bobby's career. since he was Attorney General of that administration, and the mafia stuff would have come out. And we still don't, there are accounts that the old man, when he was bootlegging during Prohibition, and then he had a distribution business. And John Davis had written in his books that there were actually two contracts that were let out by the mafia on the old man's life, because one incident that happened in Massachusetts, I think it was, or Rhode Island, and the second one was he was taking booze across Upper Michigan, which was the territory of the Purple Gang, and the Purple Gang had actually put out a contract on the old man's life for violating this informal agreement. And John Davis says that that's when Joe Kennedy went to Sam Giancana and said, "You got to lift this contract." And Sam would say, "Why would I get involved?" And he said, "Well, if you do this favor for me, my son is going to run for president and you'll have a friend in the White House." So that's different from the other story about during the election,
The West Virginia incident and all that.
in Chicago. Yeah. So we're right now waiting to see if what this plan is going to look like, this declassification plan, and how many records are going to be released. But honestly, if all they do is release the records in the JFK collection, that's not going to be the end of the day, because we need to get the records that are not in the collection. And like, Jeff Morley has been talking about the Joanides files, for example, right? So those are not in the collection. So we need to get the records. The Donald Heath memo from 1977, which I think I've mentioned to your listeners before. The CIA always denied he did any investigation into the assassination, but this Donald Heath memo, which he wrote to the HSCA in March of 77, indicating that the weekend of the assassination, he was sent down to Miami to conduct an investigation through the Miami office of all the Cubans, exiles and Cuban and Castro loyalists, to figure out if anyone was possibly involved in the assassination. And this went on for a couple of months. And there were daily site reports, situation reports sent back to headquarters, either by cable or otherwise. And he mentions that in this 1977 memo that he saw these situation reports as late as 1973 in this guy McLean's office. Now, we didn't know who Donald Heath was. His name was redacted until he died. And then in 22, the memo comes out. And now we know who he is, but we can't talk to him because he's dead. And that's the other thing that the agencies have been doing. FBI and the CIA use this 100-year rule. They will not release names until the person's dead. And if they don't know the person's birth date, if they don't know if he's dead or not, they'll use 100 years from the date of birth. But the statute doesn't say you can't release records until they die, the names. The statute says you can release the names unless it's a showing of imminent harm to the person. So they're using the wrong standard, and that's been allowed. So we don't know if those Donald Heath, the situation reports were ever searched for. So there's a lot of records that we want to be searched. And then Jeff Morley mentioned a few months ago about this whistleblower that said that he saw records at this warehouse the CIA held. Now, I think your listeners probably are aware that 2 weeks ago, the FBI announced they discovered 2,400 new records of the JFK.
Well, that's not surprising. I've been doing a witness database on the number of like the testimony the Warren Commission took and the number of people they interviewed, and I was coming across documents in like 72 and 73 where the FBI was still pursuing conspiracy leads. It's not like they just thought it was Oswald. On the surface, it might have been that, but they still kept pursuing leads years on. But two witnesses came up who worked at the Dallas police office, the headquarters building, and it was like right before they retired, but they talked about a green filing cabinet inside the Dallas police office that held JFK assassination records that was locked under key, and that they never had the chance the whole time they were there to ever check what was inside of that filing cabinet. And I was like, well, what's up with that filing cabinet? That was never talked about again. I haven't seen that statement pop up with any other witnesses or any other statements from anybody.
Is that the same? Are those the same records that the district attorney in I think it was the late 2000s, discovered some Dallas records Dallas police records and they released them.
I'm not sure. I just all I know is from their statements that was the last I've ever seen of it was just these two
But the
employees.
idea that there are 2,400 records consisting of 14,000 pages that no one's ever seen before. So the question first is that calls into question the good faith, whether the FBI made a good faith effort to search for records, not only during the R period, but the HSCA and the Warren Commission. So how did they discover this? Now, apparently these were being digitized and they discovered them. Well, they discovered them because of the president's order or what? But this is just very curious that they suddenly discovered these records. These records are not in the collection. So again, the R went out of business, but their work wasn't done.
We talked a lot about in the past about the HSCA. Now, I've been slowly making clips of testimony from the 52 witnesses that testified in front of the HSCA. Now, a lot of these are not available online. There are no video, even though there was video taken of certain parts. Some people have clips and bits like that they have, but it's not the full interviews. But I've heard, and I posted on my YouTube, I've sent you a couple. I heard J. Lee Rankin completely disarm or disable the whole Ruby motive thing about him having patriotic duty. He openly stated that it was a laughable thing to the Warren Commission, and none of the members bought that motive at all, but they didn't bother pursuing things. They opened up the idea that the FBI was the lead investigative arm of the Warren Commission, yet they only supplied files that the Warren Commission requested. So if they gave them a list of files and told them this is everything, if the Warren Commission goes, can I see JFK report 122? Then they weren't going to give it to them. So there were certain things like one of the attempts in Miami that wasn't available to the Warren Commission because nobody thought on the Warren Commission to ask for more documentation. So that's how these agencies cooperated with the commission. We have the evidence of people like Gerald Ford saying, I don't know how this could have occurred. Oh, I didn't know this and I didn't know that. We know he was supplying information to Hoover, even though he lied under oath, basically. He stated he didn't have any contact with anybody after December 17th. Well, we have memos of December 22nd, and then the next year in January where he's talking to Carl DeLoach. So there's a lot of issues there, but that testimony and all that recording is not available to the public. And if you listen to those, you're hearing these people asking the questions that all the conspiracy people have asked questions about and raised in multiple different podcasts or different forums. The congressmen and the people asked these certain individuals that. You had Jack Revel talk about 3 other witnesses that said Ruby didn't come down that ramp. Before, it was one guy said it was Roy Vaughn didn't come down that ramp. That was the longest time. Well, we have the lieutenant of the Dallas Police Department stating, no, multiple people said that, and I could tell you how he possibly got in through the back door that he must have been let through. So that's in a congressional thing. They had that done, which was great. But none of these are available online. I had to get it through Tim Smith, who had to interview someone like the 90s that sent him a drive link or a bunch of file links that he put online and then send it to me in an email. So
are these are there files, audio files of these? I mean, you said they're not available online, but are the files available? Like, are there recordings at NARA?
I don't know if they're at NARA. I've checked on Mary Farrell's site, but they don't have any of the HSCA. They have the audio exhibits of people that they interviewed, but they have certain people that I don't have. So they have people like John Stringer, and they have others that I think it's well been publicized about what their involvement was, whether it was something with the brain.
I just gave you the guy. Who's the guy? Tim Smith, you mentioned.
Yeah, he did a book on the HSCA. He was on. I sent you the episode too. You should listen to it.
But did he? So he found an audio clip. You're saying, right?
Well, he sent me 52 of the audio recordings. Right now, I'm doing clips about Gerald Ford's interview. Now you can look up.
But are any of those? I'm just trying to figure out. Are any of those audio clips? Are they not in the possession of NARA now?
I haven't seen them on NARA.
So when you go to search NARA records,
there's no audio recordings of these.
But I'm saying, but is there an inventory that the NARA has these? In other words, it's one thing to say they're not online, you can't hear them, but at least when you go to NARA's inventory of JFK records, right? Are they in the collection? Are they physically? Does NARA have the recordings?
I haven't checked that.
Because that's something. So NARA is in the process, allegedly, of digitizing the collection. And one thing that we should have is all of the audios should be digitized so they can be heard. So this is something, there's always been, and in our litigation, we've been having a problem trying to get, so that the statute gives the president the authority to declassify records of the executive branch. He doesn't have the authority to postpone or declassify records of Congress. And so the question has been records of the HSCA. And so what happened during the R period, the clerk of the House worked with Tip O'Neill to release a lot of HSCA records. And the secretary of the Senate worked with whoever was the majority leader of the Senate to do that as well. But there are records still of the Church Committee and the HSCA which remain classified. When we argued in the lawsuit that the president does not have the authority to postpone those records, those congressional records, they pushed back, the Department of Justice pushed back and said, no, even though those records are part of congressional testimony, they actually are executive records because the information came from the executive branch. So we want to turn that argument now on its head and say that if that's the position of the federal government now, then President Trump's order should apply to these records that are considered Church Committee records, that they can be declassified now by the signing of a pen by the president. Because, there's a separation of powers issue, right? But since they've taken this position in litigation that, oh, no, these Church Committee records are actually executive branch records that Congress can't release until we say, okay, then let's have President Trump say these can be released. And, their testimony of Angleton, for example, and other people from the CIA that, it's time to get these records, declassified.
I have some of the clips if you want me to play one and you can judge for yourself on that one.
Well, I wanted to know, because my issue is that I want to make sure that this effort, because who knows when this is going to happen again. We have a moment in time now. We have a president that's on the record. He made a promise to Bobby Kennedy, who's in his administration. And if things aren't done to his liking, Bobby's going to say something. So we have a moment in time now. We have Congress and the president focused on this issue. So I want to make sure that as comprehensive a search is done. And so what I was concerned about was, are these audio tapes that Smith gave you and other people you've seen, are they in the collection? Are they listed as being part of the inventory? If they are, that's great. Then we just have to get them declassified and get them online.
I know there's transcripts available. Hold on, sorry.
There's transcripts available.
Yeah, so there's transcripts. When you look at the HSCA testimony, you see exactly everyone that was interviewed. You can read it, but like you mentioned earlier, it's different hearing it than it is reading it.
Yes, and you don't know if it's accurate. Look what happened with the LBJ Hoover transcript, right? I mean, you listen to the tape and there's this missing, I don't know how many minutes. It's not 18 like Watergate, but it's close to that. And then somehow somebody made a transcript of the original tape. And it got inadvertently put into the library without, omitting the stuff that was deleted. And so that's how we know what Hoover and LBJ talked about the tapes, in Mexico City. So transcripts are not necessarily, accurate, number one. And number two, it's really important to hear the way the person speaks, because, a person can speak hesitantly, or you can hear them. Like I can tell when Ruth Payne's lying. She has a tick, but you can't tell that on a transcript. But when you listen to the person and see the person, sometimes you can get these subliminal messages.
I'll just play this for you, just one clip, and you can tell me. I think this one's important. This is J. Lee Rankin about Jack Ruby's motive.
Ruby's motive probably was that, as an obscure nightclub operator of some questionable reputation, that he thought he would become a national hero if he killed the person that assassinated the president.
I think that's true. I'm not sure that the commission was satisfied that that was the answer.
Does that seem to make some degree of logic to you? as chief counsel of the commission?
Well, it's always seemed to me that it was quite a step for a man to take, with all the risks that were involved, just for that kind of a purpose.
I don't believe the commission, in its very thorough investigation, ever tied Oswald and Ruby together in any association, did they?
They did not.
And I mean, there's so many clips about like J. Edgar Hoover, Gerald Ford testifying.
Asking him those questions.
I'd have to look it back up. It's one of the commission members. There's like they had like 8 different people go through, and since I'm listening to audio, a lot of people aren't spending time introducing their names again.
Well, it's also because some of the questions some of these were leading questions, which is okay in a setting like this, but if the person asking the question was one of those that wanted to support the Warren Commission, he was giving him ranking chances to support it. Now, that is interesting because Rankin clearly could have, said, yeah, Ruby was this for his own fame, right? But he didn't say that. And that would, to me, suggest that there's something else he knows. Now, Burt Griffin claims that Ruby did this in order to avenge the reputation of Jewish people. In Burt Griffin's thinking, the person that had paid for that ad in the Dallas Morning News, wanted for treason, was a Jewish man. It begins with a W, Weitzman, I think, or something. And so in Burt Griffin's thinking, Ruby was afraid that Jewish people were going to be blamed for the assassination of the president. And so this was a way to regain the honor of the Jewish people by killing Oswald.
Yeah, well, that's supposed to be a alleged theory because he was at the station apparently giving out sandwiches and saying that this wasn't a thing against the Jewish people. He was trying to make up for it, and he's wearing a badge that said Israel Press. I mean, he was there the whole weekend.
So Burt Griffin says to me, "Why are Jewish people not upset about this?" And I said, because Jewish people have gone through a lot of discrimination in their history, and they can tell when there's something wrong. And I said, the idea that Jack Ruby did this for the Jewish people is just a silly idea.
Well, what do you have? The psychiatric break that he had was another one that was out there. Well, I have the clip of Robert Denson, who was given an oral history for the Sixth Floor Museum, who literally said Melvin Belvi created that thing, and we were just trying to save Ruby the death penalty.
Yeah, right. That was all about the death penalty, and we have tapes of Ruby saying, I can't, basically saying in open court that, the reasons why I did this are never going to come to light, and he's, he look, we know that Marcello controlled the Dallas Mafia. That was an extension of his estate, his $1 billion empire. And Ruby, I'm sure that nobody wanted to be like, there was this guy, Action Jackson, up in Chicago, who was brutally tortured before he was murdered. And people aren't afraid of being killed by the mafia. They're afraid of being brutally tortured. And if anything, Jack Ruby did not want to be or have his family brutally tortured. If he was told to do something, he was going to do it.
Well, that's when Gerald Ford was asked that by the HSCA when they asked him about the interview, and they quoted saying, Ruby said, "Take me to Washington. I'm in danger for my life." And then they asked Gerald Ford, "You didn't think that was important to that?" And go, "We didn't. We gave him a polygraph test," and he didn't ever explain the results of the polygraph test. But one thing you mentioned, I've caught Ford in a couple little lies. And I mean, they're not like super big, like, no, I've never heard that before. They're more like he got caught in something, and you can tell these with the audio recordings when you hear them, but you wouldn't be able to tell from a transcript. This is one of them, and I clipped it up with the actual LBJ phone call. This is a very small lie compared to some of the ones I have, but...
Why did Chief Justice Warren accept the assignment as head of the Warren Commission?
I believe that Chief Justice Warren accepted the assignment from President Johnson for precisely the same reason that the other 6 of us did. We were asked by the President to undertake this responsibility as a public duty and service, and despite the reluctance of all of us to add to our then burdens or occupations, we accepted it.
I know that you personally were reluctant to accept it. You did not seek the assignment, and I doubt if any of the other members did.
Jerry, I got something I want you to do for me.
Well, we'll do the best we can, sir.
I've got to have a top blue ribbon presidential commission to investigate this assassination. I'm going to ask the Chief Justice to head it.
You know very well I would be honored to do it, and I'll do the very best I can, sir.
Keep me up to date, and I'll be seeing him.
All right.
Doesn't sound like he was very reluctant on serving on that commission. He signed up for that thing immediately. And then he got certain things, like I got to still go through Katzenbach's HSCA interview.
The then Assistant Attorney General, Mr. Katzenbach, in a deposition to this committee on page 20, he says, "It never occurred to me that the FBI would cover up anything. If you ask me the question, if the FBI failed to do something it should have done, would they have covered up that? My answer to you is, even then, would have been yes. They probably would not cover up information that somebody else was guilty of something of the kind, but if the Bureau had made any mistake or anything for which the public might criticize the Bureau would do its best to conceal that information from anybody, including the Commission." Of course, we find out now that this was true in the case of the action that was brought against the agents for a supposed failure before the assassination in handling the case of Lee Harvey Oswald.
There was about 17 members of the FBI that were disciplined by Hoover secretly because of the fact that they completely bungled the Oswald case. You know, like I said, these audio recordings are really important, but I have not been able to find them. I found a couple in full. There's J. Lee Rankins. There's Richard Helms. Some of the big names that you would know if you're a researcher and you know the case, you know, people that were involved. But the good part about the HSCA is they interview James Rowley and all these people towards the end, rather than interviewing them in the beginning. So if you would ask a question that we all know now is like the Secret Service were drinking way until early hours of the morning. James Rowley was asked that question, and then he's like, I don't recall. And you're kind of like, dude, come on, you recall. You just don't want to say it. And then the guy just hit him with it. We just had your other agent testify this morning about 9 different members that were drinking out until wee hours of the morning. So you want to rechange your statement? And then Rowley's like, you know what? We didn't think. And then he explains his whole idea of why he didn't want to tarnish their reputations, why it was an issue, but it wasn't unlike the Secret Service at the time. This is all really important stuff that we've all, conspiracy people, have individually said or researched or came across through documentation. That's why I say I haven't found any of those besides the transcripts, or you can read like the actual in the Senate intelligence book. You can actually read all of the individual testimony, but it just sounds different when you're hearing them actually say it, because you can hear.
It's really important to hear. I mean, there's a lot of communication that goes on. I mean, and these are just audio. Can you imagine seeing the visual?
Well, the videos are there too, but I haven't tried to have Tim Smith send me them, but he can't find them. He's only sent me 5 of them, and a lot of them deal with Michael Bodden of the HSCA and others.
Hold on a second. But here's the question for historic purposes. If he can't find them, does that mean, again, the question is, are these video files, are they in the collection? Are they, or it's one thing to say I can't find them because they're not online, but are these actually in the collection? We have to know if they're missing, files.
I would think that the members of the HSCA would have sent a copy of it just because they're involved in it. Like Blakey should have got a copy.
I don't know what they did in those days. Now, usually, and again, it's also important to find out who's asking these questions. Is it staff attorney? The staff are the ones that know all the facts, right? The Congress people or the commissioners on the Warren Commission, or even the board members of the ARB, they're really busy people, and their job, this is a part-time job for them. The staff are the ones that are immersed in the details, and they're the ones that do things on a daily basis. They will give information to the Congress people, for example, to ask questions. But so it's important to know who's asking the questions. And also, is it a person that is interested in finding the truth, or is it a person interested in trying to protect the truth? And so it's always important to know who's asking the questions in addition to the person that's answering the questions.
Agreed. It's just they don't really disclose it a whole lot in the audio recordings.
Yeah, that's it. These are some of the holes we have to fill, because some of the questions are open-ended. Some of them are designed to, they're kind of hinting to the person being questioned about what the answer should be. And some of it's just incompetence. So a lot of these guys.
You can also tell where people's loyalties are too. There's a guy, James R. Malley, who was literally the director of or not director. He was one of like the high agents in the FBI for like 51 years. He was the one Hoover sent to Dallas to go gather the information as soon as possible, as soon as it all happened. And they brought up Oswald's address book, and the guy questioned him. He's like, "Why is there?" He's like, "What was your job?" The guy said, "My job was to review what the FBI had on his Oswald's evidence and then submit it to the Warren Commission and like make a transcript and everything for it." He goes, "Then explain to me why a page of the transcript is missing. Was that your doing?" He goes, "I don't know. Did I sign the report?" But he was being very sassy. He was like, "It just seems like all you guys want to do is criticize the Bureau's investigation. And you guys weren't there to understand what we were going through at the time." And he's like, "Well, sir," and he's like, "Let me ask you." And the guy's like, "I'm not here to answer questions. I'm here to ask you questions." And you could tell he had hardcore loyalty to the FBI. He made it very clear in his statements.
Part of the problem is this is not just personal embarrassment. It's embarrassment to the institution that you work for. And the CIA and the FBI, you have long time career people working there. They, the whole, the spirit and the whole, Hoover and Dulles and these guys, they created a camaraderie amongst the employees. You're actually working for the Bureau or the company, and not the government. Your first loyalty is to your employer, not the government. And that's why you have bureaucratic turf wars, because they're protecting each other. Now, every person in the CIA has been given a chance to resign and take early retirement. So, I'm hoping that the changes that the people he's putting in, that their loyalty on this particular issue, that their loyalty to the president is going to outweigh their loyalty to the CIA or the FBI in terms of this issue, and that they will be willing to throw their agency under the bus in order to achieve the president's desire of releasing the records. Louis Ferrante, who just dropped the book on, he thinks Marcello was behind it. I agree with him. He had an interesting theory about Hoover. Someone said, why would Hoover hide the truth if his job is law enforcement? And he said that the mafia was so infiltrated into all parts of our government, state, local, and federal, that his job was to protect our institutions from what he perceived to be threats, which was communism. But the mafia was so intertwined in our institutions that if this information came out, it would destroy our institutions. And so, in a perverted, patriotic view of the world, you don't reveal the control the mafia and the influence mafia had on our government, to the point where they could actually change presidents because they feel the vice president is more aligned in their interests, because you can't get all these influences out of the government. You'd have no Congress. You'd have no Senate. Most of our government was with the interconnections were so, it was like another level of government within our government, the mafia connections in those days. I mean, Carlos Marcello's empire was $1 billion. He was bigger than GM, or the size of GM. So I always thought that Hoover kept the secret because Frank Costello had been giving him tips on fixed races. It wasn't about the cross-dressing and the fact that he was gay, because everyone kind of knew that. It was a thinly held secret in Washington, but it was that the chief law enforcement officer of our country was basically profiting off information about fixed rate horse races, and that they had this over him, in that if he didn't protect them in the investigation, they would reveal this about him. That's what I always thought. But Ferrante's view is kind of interesting. Ferrante is a former Gambino soldier, and he's written now his second book about the mob, and this book is actually about the assassination. So I just thought that was an interesting perspective on why Hoover was obviously LBJ's buddy, so he was going to protect LBJ as well.
Well, I believe Hoover had blackmail on both the Kennedys. It just wouldn't make sense that he would try. and get rid of them when he could use that blackmail to his advantage, unless he thought he was going to be
that's why
taken out.
LBJ, when people try to claim LBJ was behind it, that's the argument I use, is that if he really wanted to get rid of JFK, he just had to get his buddy Hoover to release the dirt on JFK. That would have destroyed JFK's career and RFK's career. So rather than try to go into a conspiracy to kill the president and possibly be hung for treason, the easier thing to do for the shrewdest politician of our time was to have his buddy release the dirt. So that's why I don't think that LBJ was involved in the plan to kill the president. Now, he clearly was covering it up. And I just, as a fair-minded person, I'm trying to think at the time that I think that they really thought that this is in the best interest of the country. I'll give them a mulligan in 1964 to cover up, because our allies were very skeptical about the lone gunman theory. If you look at the cables coming in through the State Department, they all were convinced that the United States, that President Kennedy was taken down by a right-wing conspiracy.
Yeah.
And we had to convince our allies we were not a banana republic. We were the head of the free world. And we had to reassure them that we were still, a genuine democracy that they would follow. And we had to convince, to me, the Warren Commission was as much about foreign consumption as it was domestic consumption. So what I don't give them a mulligan for is then 15 years later, or even in the 90s, at some point you got to fess up and say, okay, this is the truth. But at the time, it was the height of the Cold War. You don't want to take a risk. And they were really afraid. I really think that this was set up to force us to invade Cuba. They were going to set up this pro-Castro guy, allegedly pro-Castro guy, and that he was going to be pointed up to be the assassin. And that was going to compel us to go, invade Cuba like we invaded Iran.
Yeah, I want to play two things for you. You know about the security index thing, right? About Oswald being taken off of that?
Yes.
It's going to follow up to the next clip, but this is why I think when we examined the FBI doing its solo investigation, it was originally going to be that we had the LBJ phone call to J. Edgar Hoover about talking about that. I would prefer that you would have your investigation be the final, but all these people are going to spark up. We can't have a rash of investigations, so we have to appoint a committee. And that was the creation of the Warren Commission, where they started rattling off names of who they would want on there. James Malley was asked about the FBI's view on the Warren Commission. He was asked specifically about Hoover. Now, a lot of the audio recordings I've been able to find so far have been...
Who is James Malley?
James Malley was the guy that Hoover sent down for the FBI to go to Dallas and take care of this situation. I could not find any other photo of him besides this one that was listed on the FBI. Like, they have a list of people, and this guy was like way deep into the list. But I'll play this clip real quick.
Would I be incorrect in assuming that was not an uncommon feeling among upper echelon people within the Bureau, that in fact the creation of the Warren Commission was in fact a black eye? The very fact that it was created was a black eye for the Bureau.
The only answer I can give you on that is no official.
Is no what?
No official higher than I was discussed their feelings with me about the creation of the Warren Commission. I personally did not consider it any black eye to the Bureau. I felt that on such a matter as important as that if they wanted to create a commission to double check on what the Bureau was doing, they had a perfect right to do it. And I went along with the director's feeling that we should cooperate fully and do anything we could to help them, which we did.
Now, the FBI held a lot of information that Hoover didn't want.
That was not responsive to the question.
Yeah, there's a lot of that with James Malley.
But he went along. He said that he went along with the director's request to cooperate with the commission.
Sorry, it's the YouTube Shorts is messed up. Yeah, James Malley, for being the FBI, if you consider his background of 50-something years involved with the FBI and you listen to his statements, it makes a lot of sense why he gave the answers that he did. He never answers a question.
And the thing is, what I want to point out is that he didn't say, it was clear that Hoover did not want this commission. That's why they issued their report, and they were pissed off that then they had to now, they thought they were done on December 5th. When they issued the report. And then suddenly now the commission is now appointed, and he grudgingly cooperated with them. But he's not saying, the answer to the question was, did did anyone at the FBI feel this was a black eye? He said he was not aware of anyone above him. And then he said all he knew was that he was following the instructions of the director to cooperate. Cooperate is one thing. It doesn't answer the question about the black eye. And clearly Hoover felt he did not want anyone investigating he wanted his FBI report to be the end of the day. It was clear. And he was being dragged. You can see their memos from the general counsel asking for more information. And Hoover's pissed that he's happened now to go out and get his agents to go out and get more information. And even that one executive session of the Warren Commission, where they're talking about that Hosty was Oswald an agent of the FBI. They're saying that this is such an unusual situation with the FBI. You can never get them to say their investigation is finished. And yet here they're saying it's finished. And they would prefer we don't get involved. It's right there in the testimony.
I literally have what you're saying in their words as well too.
Mr. Miller, I just have one further. Is it your professional judgment?
Sorry, these YouTube shorts, it's hard when you're doing Zoom and trying to load it through the thing. This one I thought was funny because you could see Malley snap.
Mr. Miller, I just have one further question, and that is, with the benefit of hindsight of 15 years and looking back on what went on, in your opinion, was the overall investigation of both the assassination of the president and the murder of Lee Harvey Oswald handled properly?
Well, I might turn that around just a little bit and say you've had the benefit of the Church Committee investigations, you've had the benefit of the Warren Commission, and you've had the benefit of all our files. And maybe you could tell me what you feel we did wrong, and I'd be glad to answer what you think we did wrong.
Well, we appreciate you trying to turn the tables on us, but
I'm not trying to turn the tables.
Questions.
I'm just asking you what you feel we did wrong, and if I'm not entitled to that, well, that's that.
Okay. Well, I'm not here to answer questions.
Okay.
So with that, Mr. Chairman, I have no further.
This one with them.
Were you aware of the fact that Mr. Hoover was involved in I guess we could say the blocking of the first choice for the Warren Commission General Counsel, a man by the name of Warren Olney? Are you aware of that situation?
I don't recall that I was ever told that.
Did you learn of it subsequently?
I don't remember it. If I did know it, I don't remember it now.
It's been reported that Mr. Hoover had dossiers or files on members of the Warren Commission and staffs.
I don't recall that I was ever told. It seems to me that it would be a normal procedure if you were dealing with a large number of staff members and committee members, that it would be well to know exactly what was transpiring on each one from your standpoint of your dealings with it. So when you refer to a file or dossier on each one, I can well understand why they might have had such a thing.
Now, I would agree with that statement. That sounds pretty honest, but then if you know the background of J. Edgar Hoover, you wouldn't have that, I guess,
So
thing anymore.
So again, we're having a person, we have a polite attorney, I think, or either an attorney or a commissioner who doesn't know how to cross-examine a witness. And he's letting him off the hook. And so he's saying, I don't recall what I was told. That's two statements. He doesn't recall. And then he's recalling about being told. He's not saying I don't recall direct information. He's saying I don't recall being told that, which is not saying I don't recall this as a fact. I don't recall being told this. It's amazing how these guys were let off the hook. But this is typical bureaucratic responses. They know how to.
Well, they brought up the Miami and Chicago plots. This one I have here is Thomas Kelly of the Secret Service.
Now, later when you returned to Washington,
Thomas
you became
Kelly,
the liaison person with the Warren Commission.
Yes, sir.
Were you the principal person in the Secret Service responsible to the Warren Commission?
Yes, sir.
Did you make any independent suggestions to the Warren Commission of what areas they should or ought to investigate?
Not really, no.
Did you discuss with them concepts of conspiracy?
Oh, yes, I discussed with some of the staff the things that we had going at the time of the assassination. the kinds of threats we had.
You discussed with them the information that you had received from the field offices?
Yes.
Did you supply them all the reports in connection with that?
We supplied them with all the reports that we thought were pertinent to the assassination.
Didn't talk about the Miami plots. Didn't talk about the Chicago plots. When he was questioned again, I got the clip of that too. Like I said,
now
this
you
stuff's
also became aware of a threat made
Hold on
by...
a second.
Yeah.
When we're seeing these images, are these images you're creating, or is this the images that come with the audio?
No, I had to find these images of these guys. This is actual Thomas Kelly. In this photo, it's the picture of Marina holding her baby walking.
No.
out.
I'm saying, so when we're seeing images with the audio, that's you putting
That's
images.
me.
That's not
Yeah.
official. Okay.
Unless you just want to stare at an MP3 file logo.
No. I was just trying to find out if this was official or if this was you.
No, that's me.
Okay.
All right. Well.
Now, you also became aware of a threat made by Joseph Miltier.
Yes, I was aware of that investigation.
And what was that investigation?
Information had been received that one of the people had made a threat against the life of the president, against President Kennedy.
You specifically remember the nature of that threat was that the president would be in Miami area on November 18th, and that it would be possible to assassinate him from a high building with a rifle?
Yes.
What, if anything, did the Secret Service do to respond to that?
It was just an attempt to evaluate this threat, which was a similar threat that and we had received others like it throughout the year, whether it really meant something that the Secret Service would have to take some action on.
Now, you also...
And since they didn't think it was something that they had to take action on, they didn't bother supplying it to the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission
What their
had no
job
clue
should
about
have been was to provide that information to the Warren Commission or the HSCA and let them decide whether it was appropriate. This is a way of protecting your agency by, you've made a decision, this is not relevant, and then no one's going to look at it because your decision can't be second guessed if you don't give them the information. This is how you protect your agency.
I find the audio recordings very, very revealing when they talk about why, Thomas Kelly interviewed Oswald. James Malley was there for an interview with Oswald. They've asked both those guys, why didn't you have an audio recording? Thomas Kelly was like, well, Dallas police didn't have one and there wasn't a court reporter nearby. And it's like, you didn't bother asking any of the media? And he was like, no, I didn't bother thinking about asking any of the media. And the guy literally tells him, he goes, you have the most important person in history, the assassin, the alleged assassin. He says those words, the alleged assassin of the president, and you didn't think to do that. He goes, don't you think that would have been your first decision? And the guy was like, I didn't think of it at the time. And it just responds in such a dumb way where you're kind of seeing that there's not necessarily conspiratorial stuff, but it's like none of these people were paying attention to anything. They brought up the whole Secret Service investigation at Klein Sporting Goods. And he goes, the FBI was there before us. And the FBI told the guy at Klein Sporting Goods not to talk to anybody else. So that gave us a little bit of a hassle. And it's like you see these independent investigations going on. And so much was kept from the Warren Commission that I think that all the HSCA audio just explodes the official narrative that, okay, maybe the Warren Commission wasn't as a blue ribbon committee as we thought. They had great reputations, but none of them were informed on certain things that should have been informed on. And I think that's kind of the whole purpose.
There's that. Look at Burke Griffin was the one responsible for investigating Ruby. And Burke Griffin is not allowed to go to Dallas when they interview Ruby because Burke Griffin accused one of the Dallas policemen of lying about how Ruby got into the building. And how do you not let your staff, who's the expert on the investigation, not attend this interview so he could provide questions to ask him? I mean, there was a lack of interest in pursuing leads. You know, they were. I know that some of the staff really tried hard. I think Burke Griffin tried hard to try to get information, but I think Earl Warren made a decision very early in the Warren Commission investigation that there would not be any recordings. When they do the initial preliminary interview of the witnesses, there would be no sworn testimony or official recordings of those interviews. Specter and those guys would make a memo about what the people said, but there would be no official recording of those interviews, which is really important because you don't know what those people said. But that was a way of screening out the witnesses that were going to be problematic. And you don't create a record of these problematic witnesses because you're interviewing them informally. It's only when they went to the next phase when they started recording them. But I have a whole thing I'm working on about how the record was manufactured. And these are all the games and tools and tricks that lawyers can do to manufacture a record. And so now the staff did not like this. The staff wanted to have those interviews recorded, but Earl Warren said no. Earl Warren, the man that, protector of civil rights, trampled over people's rights during the Warren Commission.
He also withheld autopsy photographs and things that would have been pertinent to the Warren Commission members because he deemed it unruly or too much for the Kennedy family. He's trying to protect their.
I can understand the sentiment at the time. What I don't understand is how you can have a drawing done based on memory. You could have had that person look at the autopsy for purposes of creating this image that would allow Humes or whoever to testify without having the entire autopsy. I know he was concerned that if you let one person look at it or it becomes part of the record, they're going to be, it can theoretically become part of the public domain. But I understand the concern they had, but there could have been a better way than trying to get the drawing done by the recollection of Humes as to what the back of the head looked like. That's not designed to be.
Again, HSCA covered that. Ida Dox, she's the one who did the drawings and all that, and she even talked about that in her clip that I made. She literally says it over and over again that she was drawing it to the best description of what the medical panel deemed.
Right. And that allowed also them to position the head also in a way that allowed for a bullet to go, in the direction they wanted it to go and cause the injury. That it's just.
I got one for you. Hang on, right? I got one for you. J. Lee Rankin right here. This is a big guy in the Warren Commission thing.
Yep.
Based on the testimony of those doctors and the evidence developed, they were, for example, like 4 inches off on the point of entry of the head wound.
I don't know that. I've heard that your staff has discovered that and that Dr. Humes has admitted that he was that much off. At the time, it was, and since, until I heard that, it was difficult to imagine that a man conducting an autopsy could make that kind of mistakes when he was observing the body that he was examining and so forth.
Well, now that you've heard that, are you still satisfied with the decision not to even allow access to the X-rays and autopsy original data?
I think I would not do that.
Based on the test.
And it's like, what? To me, I don't know. I think we really kind of mind the HSCA's work that they did when you start listening to these things. But I have all these clips available on the channel for people to be able to look at, and you can look at it on your phone, so it goes real quick. So I'm not going to try and play anymore, but it's just crazy because throughout all the 3 years I've been looking into this and speaking with researchers, every little bit of detail where you find it maybe in a document or even the 24th Hoover memo about Oswald, we have to convince the public he's the real assassin. They have James Malley in there and they ask him about what Hoover meant by that. And he was like, I don't think you can take what Hoover said out of context like you're doing. I think what he meant to say was the public can't be riled up, that there might be other assassins out there, but we're not convinced that there was anybody else but Lee Harvey Oswald. And the guy was like, you're not? And he goes, no, sir. And it's just like, there's a lot of things you're hearing now where it's like, damn, the important questions were asked, but I mean, the HSCA ran out of money too. So it's like you really kind of hit into this decision of.
Oh, they ran out of money. Their budget got cut.
Yeah.
Lakey, when he took over, basically told the staff, our job is to issue a report. That's what Congress wants. That's what the American people want. And that is our work product. And we have to get it by a certain date. And it was everything about the end product. It wasn't about let the investigation proceed and let it run its course. It was, we have to issue a report. That is what we have to do. Just like in September of 1964, was it September? Or was it August? When who was the commissioner? Was asking to do further investigations about things, and Rankin said, "We're at the point of closing the investigation down, not opening up new leads."
Not Sprague, right?
It wasn't Sprague.
He was
no,
the original.
It was the guy from California, the lawyer. Just drawing a blank on his name now. He's the one that worked on the book, the first book about the Warren Commission. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now.
Bugulos's book?
No. The book that was originally a college paper. The guy
I know what you're saying. The quote is that we're working on not creating more conspiracies or more doubt. We're trying to head them off or something of that sort. I know that
it was
statement.
like, it wasn't even about conspiracies. That we're closing down the investigation, getting ready to write a report. We're not in. It's too late to start doing more. We're not pursuing more information. I'm trying to think. I just can't remember.
It'll come to you. Skip over it.
It was Inquest. Inquest. Was it Inquest? It was Edward J. Epstein. So his first book, and I'm trying to think who it was that there was the one Warren commissioner. I'm just drawing a blank right now. The guy from California, from UCLA. He was the
secondary committee, not the main committee.
This is the Warren Commission.
I know, but there's the Warren Commission members, the one that we all know, the faces of it, and there's the lawyers.
Yeah. The staff.
Arlen Specter, Stearns, shit, I'm forgetting. There's another one that's
the
really
guy
big.
was accused of trying to date one of the witnesses or something. Or, I just can't remember his name right now. God, this is so frustrating.
He was pulling a hostie trying to get with the
Liebler.
Oh, Liebler.
Yeah, so Liebler was a real supporter of Epstein. And anyway, so Liebler's the one that was trying to get more information, and Rankin shut him down. And of course, they had at the last minute in September, that's when they had the Odio stuff, right? So, they were still investigating when the report was going into production.
I want to get to a wrapping point here, but I want to ask you what your thoughts are on this commission, or this appointed commission, over whatever you want to say, the new one that is going to be looking at some of these things. Do you think you're hopeful for it? I mean, do you expect files to actually be fully released? Or do you think it's going to be more backpatting? We get a slow release and then it'll be pushed on to the next thing.
I don't know. So the Oversight Committee has subpoena power. So the question is, how serious are they going to be about this? They have a lot of things they're supposed to be investigating. They got JFK, MLK, RFK, Epstein, and UAPs. And that's a lot of stuff to handle. So if they're going to have like one public hearing and that's it, let me just say that because she did send that letter asking for an update on the 26th, I'm optimistic that they're going to put pressure on the executive branch to release records. Again, my biggest concern is that they don't limit themselves to the JFK collection. If that's all they're going to do, then we're not really going to, end our questions, because there are records that are not in the collection we need to get to see and to release. So I'm cautiously optimistic about some of the initial steps that she's taken, Anna Luna. This is a chance for her, just from a PR and political standpoint, to become well known. So, but I don't know who their staff is. I don't know how they're going to conduct their investigation. And, there's going to be a lot of skepticism about the motivation of this effort. There are people that I have friends that are anti-Trumpers, that they're on JFK Facts, they're on they're on, Education Forum, they're all over the place, and they didn't even believe he was going to do anything. And then when the order came out, obviously people were disappointed because he didn't say, I hereby declare. And people are skeptical that he's ever going to follow through on this. So I think because he made a promise to Bobby that we're going to get records released, but I think there's still going to be redactions. And that's going to be, if there are redactions, we need to have an ARB-like body to review those requests. If this is done internally, like they did with Biden, it's not going to be satisfactory to the research community. We need to have specific explanations for each document as to why a specific redaction is in the interest of the public, is necessary to protect national security. We can't have a blanket statement saying these records are being redacted because of concerns for national security. What we need is the same process that was done during the ARB, which is a document by document statement as to why this information in this particular document is being withheld. And if we don't have anything short of that, is not going to be sufficient for the American people. We need to be assured that this information, I don't think any of us, if there's a legitimate national security reason for postponing release of a certain piece of information, I don't think anybody wants to jeopardize national security. But we have to make sure that this is a legitimate reason. The argument that, Mr. President, if we release names that we promised 60 years ago we would never release, that's going to interfere with our ability to get information, get someone to work for us, to get undercover, in Russia or some other country in the Mideast or something. That to me that is just typical bureaucratic, conservative, positioning. Right? We need specific, how is this information going to affect? It's going to reveal a particular method and, practice. Personally, if we're using the same methods from the 1960s, I'm a little nervous about that. But that's the kind of thing we need. We need specificity this time. But we don't have a search of the records, not in the collection. That to me is going to be an incomplete effort, and I would give it an F. If there's no records, if the Marcello records are not unsealed, if the Joannides records are not put into the collection, if that stuff is not done, if the RFK records are not released. Now, we have an issue that is a problem with the William Manchester tapes and the Oswald tax records. The JFK Act does not give the president the authority to declassify those materials because the Manchester tapes are by a deed of gift from the Kennedy family. And the IRS and the Oswald records are subject to a statute with the IRS. We need to have the Schweikert bill. David Schweikert had introduced a bill last year and introduced a bill again this year. And I believe that Steve Cohen, Democratic representative from Tennessee, from Memphis, signed on to it, co-sponsored it. It would override those two provisions. But absent getting legislative or convincing the Kennedy family to release the condition on the deed of gift, which I don't think is going to happen with this administration. I mean, Carolyn Kennedy already, trashed her cousin, Bobby Kennedy. Personally, I think because she lost her cushy ambassadorship in Australia when the Biden administration was not reelected. Those William Manchester materials are not to be released till 2067, pursuant to the deed of gift. And we need to we're going to need a legislative solution or get the Kennedy family to agree to release that condition so that information get released. And those are two other things that, so there's three things I'm looking at holistically. One is the collection has to be released in full. And if there are any documents in that collection that are held back, we need specific explanation as to why particular information in each document is being held back. That would be consistent with the spirit of the law, number one. Number two, we need collection. The rest of the records that we can get under the Act that are not in the collection have to be put in the collection and released. And again, any redactions have to be specific. And number three, these other two areas that we can't get access to because of the way the statute is currently written, the deed of gifts and the Oswald IRS records, we need to have a solution to that issue, either by legislation or perhaps getting Marina Oswald to waive the release of that information.
Well,
or the daughter.
If anybody can get her out of wherever she's hiding at.
I think I told you that I and Bill Simpich had offered in 2018, I think it was, to bring a real life court of inquiry petition in Texas. Texas has a court of inquiry petition. In fact, by the way, the Warren Commission also shut down. Texas was going to bring a court of inquiry into the assassination. And they did not want that. So there was going to be a potential congressional investigation. There was going to be a Texas investigation. And Johnson didn't want either one of those. So the solution was to get a blue ribbon commission, and that shut down both of those. But Texas has a proceeding that you can bring for people that were improperly convicted. You could bring a petition to expunge the arrest, or at least expunge the conviction. Now, the statute does not apparently contemplate people being killed while in police custody, but we were going to bring a petition in Texas court to try to expunge Oswald's arrest on the grounds of lack of probable cause. But we needed Marina or the daughters to allow us to do this on their behalf. And I wrote a long letter to Marina, Bill and I did, basically saying, you don't want to be like the Mudd family from Civil War, where Dr. Mudd had fixed the broken ankle of John Wilkes Booth. And then he ended up being convicted as part of a conspiracy for his following his duties, as a doctor. And for 100 years, the Mudd family has tried to, undo this, and they've been unable to. I understand Roger Mudd, the broadcaster, was a descendant of Dr. Mudd. So I said to them, you don't want your descendants to have the taint of Oswald, on the daughters, on your granddaughters, your grandchildren, your your descendants. And she wouldn't do it. She didn't want to be involved. Now, she's been burned in the past. In 1995, they got a bunch of people together and they said, there was no legal route for her to exonerate her husband, when this Texas procedure was there all along. I don't know why the people that advised her in 95 were not aware of this. Bill and I found it like within a day when we decided to try to look at this. So I'm just shocked, But anyway, she's been burned, and I think she just wants to be a grandmother. But that's something that someone should pursue, either do it by statute or get it for her to waive. Now, I personally don't think that there's going to be any evidence in those IRS records that he was working for the CIA. I can't imagine that they would give him a check, for example, that would require him to get a 1099. I mean, if he got paid, it was probably in cash, and it was never reported.
Larry, is there a place where people can find your links? JFK Facts Podcast.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a co-host in JFK podcasts. I have a website, Schnapf.com, that I have a Kennedy section on it, and then I have a YouTube, JFK CSI. Right now I'm focusing on trying to get the records released. But if you Google my name, you'll find some stuff out there.
I'll link it all in the description. I got you, Larry. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank podcast. If you check out Larry's past episodes, you can see we've talked in depth on certain aspects of things that we might not have addressed here. A lot of this was about the modern day stuff and then some audio evidence. But I appreciate you guys for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. Make sure to like and subscribe.
I'm really glad. By the way, I just want to say something that I'm thrilled that, we don't have enough of your generation working on this. to your generation, the JFK assassination is to what World War I was to my generation. But for you guys, it's not purely a historic incident, because things that happened in 1963 are continuing to affect our government now. And that's why it's important for you guys to continue to carry the baton. And just one example, no one at the Secret Service was punished when they destroyed the records of the threat assessments against the president in the fall of 1963. After they were requested by the ARB, the records were destroyed. No one got punished. So not surprisingly, when the Secret Service is asked for emails about January 6th and they're destroyed, so if people don't get punished for wrongdoing, these things are going to continue to happen, which is why, so what they learned, lessons they learned from the Kennedy assassination about the lack of accountability, the ability to lie and get away with things and not be held accountable, that continues to imbue, our government. I mean, it goes beyond the Kennedy assassination. We have unresponsive bureaucrats that they're now in my line of work, I deal with regulators all the time that try to enforce the law that they wished Congress passed, not the law that they passed. And so they try to stretch the law. And we need to have people held accountable in order to have a democracy and a responsive government to our people. So the Kennedy assassination is a window into the way our government works. And if we can at least get this issue out in the open, as Justice Brandeis once said in the 1920s, sunshine is the best disinfectant. If people know that their memos and their actions are going to see the light of day, they will act differently than if they think they can hide things and never be held accountable. So I just want your generation to realize that this is not about a purely historic event. This is about the way the government operates and is operating today. And so if we can get transparency on the Kennedy assassinations, it may start a precedent, or at least a path forward for our government to be more transparent about today's activities. So those of us who are in our 70s, we're not going to be here another 10, 15 years. It's going to be on you guys to try to make us a more perfect union. And so I really appreciate that you're taking the time to do this. And for those of you who are listening to this, try to take up the mantle, because this is going to affect the rest of your lives. If we can't get this information uncovered, the government's going to learn that, yes, once again, we can hide behind false stories and accounts and continue to do what we want to do in defiance of the American people. So I encourage you all to, thank you, Robbie, for your hard work. And I just encourage everybody who's a younger generation to get engaged on this issue so that we can start getting transparency in our government and make it more responsive to the American people.